Dr. Nerenberg's Mind-Body Workout System.
Welcome, 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 my dear brothers and sisters. It's a pleasure to be in your presence. An honor to have this opportunity to reach deep within myself and share with you insights and understandings and inspirations of a lifetime experience. We're also very fortunate in having today Carmen Rodriguez, to whom I dedicate this lecture and this interview. It was his idea to be talking about unions, and I expanded the topic. The name of today's class is The Creation, Corruption, and Regeneration of Idealistic Institutions. A mouthful. The creation, corruption, and regeneration of idealistic institutions. We'll be talking about social philosophies such as communism, religions, unions, all go through that process of a creation, a visionary creating it, whether it's a divine teacher or a philosopher. And then typically goes through a corruptive process where the organization becomes run by bureaucrats who want to just enrich themselves, and then the spirit becomes lost. And then becomes a regeneration, a resurgence happens to regenerate it with spirit again. So that's why I'm calling it the creation, corruption, and regeneration of idealistic institutions. Let's start off with a little background material, particularly when we want to talk about there are two in particular that I want to address around social philosophy, and they're both related to the Industrial Revolution. Let's look at communism and unions. They both were created because of the Industrial Revolution. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, we were basically agrarian, farmers raising their crops. The families would be out there raising the crops, working together out in the fields, raising corn or whatever the product, whatever the commodity, or dairy farmers having their cows, taking their animals to start eating their meat. And prior to that, of course, you had and right simultaneously with that, the hunting. So you basically had more families, tribes, even nations. Then once you had the Industrial Revolution, then you started having factories. What happened? The husbands, the wives, the children started going off into the factories, starting in England and spreading throughout the world. They would go to factories. So you had capitalists, you had people who put up the money, built the factory, and then people would be then working in there however many hours, working with machines, and working in conditions that in the early days were far from ideal. In fact, they were typically lethal. You had children losing limbs. Children would lose limbs. People would be breathing intoxicants, things that were damaging, causing cancers. No medical benefits, no retirement benefits, no disability benefits. You lost an arm, or you just use your other arm, or out in the street you went. There was no workers' rights. In other words, you existed only as a pawn. You existed as a pawn to produce for the industrialist, for the capitalist, for the boss. That was your only function. Your humanity, your individuality, that was not an issue. Just what you could do in terms of production on the factory line. There'd be assembly lines, and you had your production. And you had enormous wealth generated. I mean, especially once the assembly line was developed where we can mass produce, thousands of cars, hundreds of thousands of munition and guns, tens of thousands in garments, instead of having to sew everything from a cottage industry where people were home, maybe weaving and sewing. Now you can mass produce it and sell it at a fraction of the cost. So naturally, it came to dominate the commerce internationally, because you could produce this at a much lower price and sell it for a lower price than if it was hand done. So factory production became a way of life because the cottage industries couldn't compete with those kind of prices. Both communism and the unions sprung out of that. If there hadn't been an industrial revolution, you wouldn't have had communism. You wouldn't have had unions. So if we start off, let's take communism, for example. there was such a disparity. You had the worker going to work, putting his whole life in there and being discarded if he got old or disabled. He or she got old or disabled, boom, out in the streets. And then you had an aristocracy becoming, wealthy beyond any comprehension. And essentially, then their benefactors, the beneficiaries who inherited, they did very little. They were independently wealthy. They hardly had to do anything. So they were no longer really productive. So you had a productive working class, a productive labor class, and then an aristocracy that lived off the production of the working class. And literally and then you had then of course also you had the same thing happening in the farms. You had the peasants working the fields or whatever, and then you had the same thing there where you had the large farm owners who had the properties. So you had both the industrial aspect and also the farming. Well, you had large landowners who were just, and typically, the peasants and the factory workers were all just barely on subsistence, whereas the owners of the properties or the factories lived in opulence.